Welcome to De-Risk, Pre-Plan, Execute, planning for success in your liquidity event. This session is presented by PNC and Womble Bond Dickinson. Let's meet our panelists. First, Jim Benedict, Senior Wealth Strategist, PNC Wealth Management. Next, Pete Stewart, President, Forest to Market. And your moderator is Scott Anderson, Partner at Womble Bond Dickinson. Scott, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thanks, and good morning here. This is the program topic of de-risking and pre-planning for a successful liquidity event. In good times or bad, planning is always going to be what's going to be the most helpful actions you can take on the front end to create a successful event. I'm here today with Jim Benedict of PNC and Pete Stewart of Forest to Market. Pete went through a liquidity event about this time last year, maybe a few months earlier in the year. And I'm going to turn it over to Pete to start the discussion. And Pete, if you'd tell us a little bit about the transaction with Forest to Market, what led you guys to it, and how it went.
Yeah, thank you very much. Forest to Market has been in business for about 20 years. We were founded in 2000. And we were founded with private equity money to begin with, so it was always the specter of a sale. And but it took us quite a few years to get to the scale that made sense for a liquidity event. And about in 2015, we were getting close to that a scale. Yet the market was very good. Our business was growing quickly. So we decided to wait until we did completed a few global initiatives. And once we did that, in conjunction with the markets that got very frothy in 2018, especially for recurring revenue businesses such as Forest to Market, we decided to go ahead and go to market in early 2019 and had a successful liquidity event in August of 2019. A large private equity company named Battery Ventures bought us, and their idea was to build price reporting and recurring revenue businesses in three verticals. One was forest products, the second one was steel and related materials, and the third was chemicals. So Forest to Market was their first purchase, and we subsequently have bought another business in forest products and then a second one in chemicals. So that was their strategy, and we were the vehicle to start that process.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pete. So you've heard a brief overview from Pete as to how a transaction comes together and works. Jim, can you tell us briefly how PNC interacts with these sorts of transactions and how your team helps owners think through liquidity events on the front end?
Sure. We've essentially integrated wealth management with our commercial and corporate banks. I'm a private business strategist, and my job as a financial planner for business owners is to really help them think through their transition options, what their pre-transaction planning should be, help them through the keep sell decision and making that, and then evaluating how they're going to live their lives after the transaction. We get involved because typically we're the bank for the company that is going through the transaction. We're either lending or banking or providing other financial services to the company, where we will coordinate and make referrals for M&A services if the client needs that.
Fantastic. And then just for everybody's benefit, I'm a M&A attorney, and here at Womble, we help business owners transition through these transactions, help to pre-plan, help to execute, negotiate the purchase agreement, and then help after the fact as much as we can with ongoing business needs. Pete, let me give it over to you for a minute to talk about communication here. Communication is always key in these transactions, both with the other side that's coming in as the buyer, but really also with your own stakeholders. You mentioned Forest Market was backed by private equity early on. I believe you also had some management team ownership. How did the communication with the stakeholders work during your process?
Well, that is a real key to a fluid transaction here. There's from the employee side and the management side, you really have kind of, I guess, would say you have two levels of employees. You have employees that are in management and have an ownership stake in the company. And so a liquidity event for them is very positive. So for those employees, there's nothing but positive outcomes. For the more staff level employees, it varies because some of them would be young and just looking to build their career. And as long as they're with a company that's growing and they're interested in what they're doing, there is little consequence for them. But for some of the middle level managers that are mid-career that might not be incented to or don't have incentive for money at the exit, there is some anxiety that comes in, particularly with a new owner and a new private equity owner, which they don't really know the outcome for them, the mid-level manager employee. So there just has to be a lot of open communication and open dialogue. One thing that was going for Forest Market and gave our employees a lot of comfort was the fact that we were the first acquisition, and Battery Ventures chose Forest Market to be the platform from which to grow. So we were in the driver's seat, so to speak, here. And so that gave a lot of comfort to the employees across the whole spectrum. It was really a non-event for the customers, and it surprised me a little bit. I'll say most of the customers just shrugged their shoulders. Fine, as long as we get good service, we really don't care. I mean, that's what most of them said. And since the senior management of Forest Market was staying in place, there wasn't going to be a management change. So most of the customers, in fact, I would say 100% of the customers thought it as a non-event, which was frankly a little surprising. Then communication with the private equity firm. I think that before you ever get into a process of selling your company, you really have to understand the value system of the company buying you, or the entity buying you. You really do. And I've heard this over my career for forever, but until you really experience it, maybe you don't really understand it. And I didn't as good as I should have. They have to have some aligned values, and particularly the senior management of the would-be acquired company and the senior management of the private equity firm need to agree on the vision going forward. That means the vision for the employees, the vision for the executives, the vision for the growth of the company. And if you can come to that agreement, then things are going to be fine, really. And if both parties stick to that agreement and don't waffle around, sure. I mean, that's always unknown, right? But if I was given any advice to some entrepreneur, I would just make sure that you really understood the intentions of the buyer very clearly.
That makes a lot of sense. Jim, I'm going to guess that you have a similar but slightly different take sometimes on vision and whatnot, because I'm thinking you probably work with a lot of family-owned businesses that have been with the bank for a long time that are looking to sell or create generational transfers. And do you have to deal with competing visions sometimes, or what's been your experience across maybe some multiple data points?
Well, besides the issues that Pete brought up as far as visions or the interests of various stakeholders in the company, you also, in a family-owned business, you have competing interests of family members very often. Sometimes we have some who are in the business, some who are not actively participating in the business, but both sets of people may be shareholders. So we have to work through that and how we balance everybody's interests there. The one thing we talk to business owners about a lot is understanding what their ultimate outcome needs to be. What are their goals for the business? Is it to sell the business? Is it to provide generational wealth to their family through employment? And then we work backwards from their goals to understand whether they want to keep the business, what kinds of methods we can use to keep the business in the family, or if they want to sell the business, how do we do it in a way that accomplishes their goals? If your goals are to maximize the value of your business at sale, without regard to your employees, unlike what we just heard, then you may go a different route than if your employees are of paramount importance to you. That brings in another set of options or issues we need to evaluate. And so we really help guide the business owner through the mental side of the transaction and what their plans are for their business. That's the first step. All along providing financial analysis that backs up and provides guidance into the impact of different options on their family.
That sounds great. Pete, you mentioned one thing about customers and how the forest to market transaction was a non-event for customers, which are also a stakeholder aside from the buyer and the employees and the other shareholders of the corporation. And I agree, as folks don't yet know, but Pete, you and I obviously worked on the forest to market transaction together. And we've seen that experience with customers quite frequently, where particularly when it's really just a change of ownership, one private equity fund for another, and you can say truthfully, of course, that the management team and the service team is staying on board. That's been a benefit to making it a non-issue for customers. But that's one thing that I think should be key on sellers' radar is to the extent you have key customers, a very concentrated customer base. Maybe there's one customer that makes up 40% of the revenue or something like that. The buyers are going to be really focused on retention of that business because, that's part of the value that they're purchasing. And so we always advise our clients to sort of get out ahead, just like Pete had done with the customers who are, also stakeholders here, to make sure that they're aware and comfortable. Even if you are running a process and can't tell them who the buyer might be, you can start to indicate, hey, most people that are private equity owned know that there's going to be a transaction at some point because private equity and institutional investors, make their money by, making a return on the business. And so we start those conversations with customers and even sometimes key vendors or other service providers that are core to the business early on, and that helps create a smoother transition down the road with any customer consents, because they feel like they're a part of the process. And Pete, your experience is not anomalous, really, in the sense that for businesses that have built good brand reputation and have good relationships with their customers, bringing the customers along and making sure it's a non-issue from a service delivery, because that's generally what customers are going to be most concerned about. But that's an important thing that often can get overlooked until the very end of the process and say, oh no, we've got to go and get 15 customer consents before the buyer closes with us next week. And, what do we say? How do we do it? How do we approach it? But keeping that eye on the ball kind of early on and throughout the process is one of those helpful anecdotes. I think that business owners can use to leverage and make for a smoother transaction.
Yeah, you had a great point there, if I can interject for 1 second. There were a couple of our contracts that required consent if we had a major change in ownership. And those slipped in over the 20 years, and quite frankly, I had forgotten about them, And I can imagine if you had 10, 15, 20, 30 of those, that would be a real challenge to closing a deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, and often not to go too far down the structural discussion, but a lot of times when deals are structured as asset purchases, which is one way to sell your business, there's tax implications for that, and or stock purchases, which is another way to do it. The asset ones almost always do require consent from the customers or other stakeholders that aren't at the table, and so it can create a process that adds some length to the overall deal timeline. So one of the other practice pointers for business owners is, as they begin to look forward to a transaction, is sort of getting the house in order a little bit and starting to look through some of those 20-year contracts that have just been sort of on auto renew, which is great for the business, but it becomes, oh gosh, we got to go look at what that thing says when we go to sell this. And that way, even the seller's not really surprised by what they may have to do, because the buyer almost always is going to do a deep dive into the documents, the finances, customer contracts, and you don't want to be surprised as a seller by what the buyer is going to find. You kind of want to do your homework on the front end so that you can be prepared and to work on those issues. I'm gonna. Yeah, Jim, jump on.
I would interject real quick there. One of the things you said was get ahead of it. And so we've been talking about getting your house in order on the corporate side within the entity and the business operations. There's a parallel on the personal side where you get everything in order. And the earlier you do it, the better. We've talked about what the family goals are. The children should not be surprised if you sell the business. There should have already been conversations that, I'm going to sell this, and you're either going to have to find something else to do or live on, your inheritance, whatever the answer is. But business owners really need to start thinking very early before a transaction, if their business is in excess of the estate tax exclusion, which right now joint, $23 million in round terms, how they're going to address that, because that liability has to be paid within 9 months after the date of death. And so if you think about it, if you thought about a public company, if they had to turn over 40% of their equity to the federal government every 30 years, every generation, they'd probably have to book that as a liability on their balance sheet. And so CFOs really need to think about if something really goes wrong and the owner and spouse both die prematurely, unexpectedly, how do we keep this business going? And that's what pre-transaction planning is about. It's not really, well, I'm going to go do a transaction and now I'm going to do the planning. It should be happening all along.
That's exactly right, Jim. It's it goes to the idea that so much of the focus around a transaction is often, the buyer, the structure, when a lot of the personal impact is on the back end with the family, with the tax implications, estate planning, as you've mentioned. And we've seen transactions before in my line kind of get towards the end, and then somebody engages a wealth manager and realizes, oh my, if I'd have known that I was going to lose 40% of the value of this, I would have structured it differently, or I would have done it in a few years, or I would wait until this or that event happens to see if I can restructure things. So we've seen transactions get delayed when people kind of realize the true cost of the transaction. And we've also seen transactions accelerate. Several years ago, there was a significant tax change that was coming into effect at the end of the year. And so there were a number of transactions trying to close before January 1 to take advantage of an old tax regime.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult, particularly in these days, to prognosticate, what might change with tax rates, corporate, individual, or otherwise. But I know a lot of business owners sort of do some armchair quarterbacking around that as they think about how they may move forward, simply because that becomes an expense that will filter down through everything.
That's really true. I think we're talking about an ideal scenario, and I think all three of us operate in areas that nothing is ever really ideal. But ideally, you would have your wealth manager, your trust and estates attorney, your investment manager, your deal attorney, all or a business attorney ahead of a transaction, all coordinating your planning to make sure that if your plan really is to sell your company, that the planning is going to be structured in a way that's going to make selling the company as easy as possible. That there's nothing too far outside of the box that's going to spook an M&A firm or a private equity group.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the other, we talked about taxes and how that can impact things. We're in a global pandemic right now. Pete, I know you were fortunate enough to close the Forest to Market transaction last summer before COVID-19 hit. It's certainly impacting transactions. We're seeing deals now take a little longer due to the buyers digging into diligence deeper. We're seeing a little bit of a shift towards more earnout and delayed purchase price, kind of based on performance. But Jim, what have you seen recently? And then Pete, I want to go to you because I think you've closed a deal in the COVID-19 era, an add-on, and I think you may be in the middle of one right now. So, Jim,
we're seeing the exact same thing. We had a few clients that were in the middle of negotiations with the private equity group. They got delayed or tabled. We had one that was pretty far down the road. It was in an industry that's not impacted by COVID, and it closed for the agreed price on the agreed terms pre-COVID. Other industries, they're getting delayed, more back end, same thing. We're seeing the same thing, but we haven't seen anybody completely take their deal off the table yet. That said, we just haven't been working with industries that were like hospitality that were really impacted by the pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. So what we've experienced is we closed one transaction on April 1st of 2020. So that was midstream of the panic, and we had started that. And I think I would say in my estimate, we probably were able to discount that sale 10% or so. Now, it had already started. The owner was motivated to sell, so there was some other factors. And then since then, we have been involved in a couple transactions. So far unsuccessful, but we're in the middle of one. And I would say that the owners are still have valuation expectations of 2018 and 19. The buyers have some discount to that of 5 to 10% or something. But what's happening is, right, the valuations are going down a little bit, and the terms are getting a little tougher. They are, and the deals are more weighted to either earnouts or some sort of seller financing that I didn't see so prevalent in 2018 or 19. So the terms are changing a little bit. But I believe, although I'm not on the forefront of this every day, I believe there are less deals being done. I would say that's probably accurate. But Scott, you would know better than I.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I would tend to agree that there seems to be, a dip in volume. There are still deals getting done, and we haven't, like Jim had mentioned, our team has not seen deals come completely off the table. due to COVID. Now, we were working several in the hospitality and event management kind of space that have gone on pause short term. Parties are still getting along very well. It's just, not the right time to necessarily engage in a transaction maybe in that space because it's a higher risk at the moment. But indications are that things, when we clear this, a bit like we had such rampant activity after we came out of the Great Recession in 08, 09, when things really came back online because there was a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of what the private equity firms call dry powder sitting on the sideline, cash ready to be deployed. Most of what I'm seeing says that, the volume will pick up considerably. Maybe it's the second half of next year, maybe it's the first part of next year, kind of depending on how the pandemic landscape plays out. But things seem to be maybe put on hold or slowed down, but not necessarily completely taken off the table. But we don't know what we're not seeing from things never getting off the ground either. But hopefully, the volume of deals over a 5-year period might be similar. It's just that it'll be compressed into a 4-year period, perhaps. Great. So, Jim, let me start with you and then Pete, you can think about this question because I'll come to you. But what if you had one piece of advice to give to a business owner preparing and executing on a significant liquidity transaction in general or specifically in these days? What would your one piece of advice be?
I would say the best time to start planning is yesterday, and the second best is today. So get your affairs in order, make sure your personal house is in order, that your family understands what's going on. Do your planning and continue updating it based on how your goals for the business change. But do it early. Don't wait until to your point earlier, I've got a transaction on the table. Ooh, I got to go do all this planning. Well, that's usually too late. By the time you're under letter of intent, you have foreclosed a lot of estate planning opportunities that you had before then. So plan early.
Plan early.
Yeah. I would say that there's certainly that. Plan early. Think about who your potential buyer is, whether that's private equity, a strategic, who knows what. Think about what would de-risk the business for them and plan accordingly. So de-risk the business, have your audits, make sure your accounting is in perfect condition, CRM processes, all those sort of things, your marketing, your brand, your strategy. Don't just do them, document them, and then repeat those over the years. And what the buyer will perceive is there's less risk in this business because these managers know what they're doing, and that's a good thing. Of course, you've got to grow your business, grow your sales, a lot of other things too. But I would say that one thing that's I certainly underestimated, but had been coached over the years to do, is to make sure your systems are in order, and that would de-risk the eventual sale. And that is absolutely true. So that would be my advice there for entrepreneurs. Of course, it's easier said than done when you're just, you don't have much money. You're trying to build a business, build revenue, spend all your money on sales. It's quite hard to spend money on something that's not generating revenue when you're a young company. So there's got to be a balance, and I do understand that, but it cannot be overlooked.
That makes sense. Yeah, and to go back to something, Pete, that you said at the beginning about vision, I know that you were really out in the marketplace talking with potential buyers, sort of generating those relationships, knowing that at some point there was going to be a liquidity event. And so really, and to Jim's point, over the last, really 5 years, sort of you saw there was going to be a horizon, there was going to be a deal. So you started early, you had your house in order, you were having the conversations to find alignment. I always like to tell people it's a little bit selling your business is a more robust version of something simple like selling your house, and which is not necessarily simple, by the way. But you want to get everything in order. You want to do the painting, spruce up the yard, things that are going to also make it look like you've taken care of the asset that you've been entrusted with. And so, we often work with clients and would suggest, the earlier the better, as Jim has said. That's great. And the more you can be in this reliable habit of, having a regular cadence of financial audits and customer contracts being just in general order, knowing where they are, things that suggest or verify for the buyer that you know what you're doing, you've run the business well. To use the house analogy, you're not going to open the door and have the doorknob come off in your hand. It might be great, but there's little things that give buyers, who are all human, a pause to say, do we need to dig deeper over here because this isn't quite as nice as we'd like it to be over there? And so I think that pre-planning and then engaging in the process as early as possible. And Pete, as you've said, sort of throughout, engaging in the process almost throughout the ownership of the business, on the idea that at some point there's going to be a liquidity event. So, you can run the company like you're going to have to turn it over one day, whether that's to a family member, to an outside buyer, to a private equity institutional buyer that's going to keep you in charge to kind of run and grow the next business. But that planning is really key. Well, before I take us out, any parting thoughts from Jim or Pete?
Have a plan for what you're going to do after you sell your business.
That's right. Not just picking out the out paperwork.
I would say that's absolutely great advice. The other advice is to, as an entrepreneur, when you sell the business, you enter into a new phase of business ownership. It shouldn't really be thought of as negative. It's just a new phase where you're still engaged. You still have management ownership, but you can play a lot larger. And that is an exciting part for me. My ownership went down naturally, which it should have, and that's fine. But the opportunities were vastly expanded. And that's not only opportunities for me, it's opportunities for our employees and everyone. So that's the exciting part.
Great. Well, Jim and Pete, thank you very much. We are now going to move over into the live Q&A session from the audience. So we'll open that up in a minute and keep going from there. Jim, I want to start with you and one of the questions that we got in the chat box during the session here. You talked about planning early and the importance of planning for a liquidity event. One of the questions got sort of is how much is too much in terms of planning and pre-planning for a liquidity event. So can you let us know how you think about that?
Well, I don't think you can ever start early enough for planning. And the key question for business owners is, unlike people who work in corporate America, the bulk of business owners' net worth is illiquid in their business. And so the question for an owner is what is the amount I can monetize out of the business, and will that support my lifestyle? And so the first step is really to go through the financial planning process, which yields two main answers. One is will you have enough liquidity after an event to support your lifestyle and your goals and aspirations as you live the remainder of your life? And two, it really yields an answer on what's the total value of your gross estate, which leads us down the path of estate planning and mitigating your overall transfer tax at your death. And so you get two answers from beginning the financial planning process early.
That sounds great. And sort of from the macro deal level perspective, I would say, you want to do enough of your own diligence to kind of know what to expect, do some market tests, talk to various parties that are in the space to figure out what your valuations might be. But probably don't completely try to game theory everything out, because you can, end up in a paralysis of information at some point on the structures, the buyers, the way you can go. It's one thing for people on the buy side, like private equity funds that do this day in and day out and may do 15 deals a year. To look at all the variables, but I have seen situations where you really want to plan more on the personal side, Jim, like you've talked about, and have an idea of what the transactions should look like, but not try to game theory out every single possibility as a seller, because you may spend more time thinking about all of those sorts of things than actually pushing forward on the transaction itself. So another question that's come up in the chat box is now still a good time to aim for a liquidity event? My personal view is any time is good if the signals are right and you think you may have good value and a good chance to get it done. But everybody thinks about these a little differently. Jim, what's your thought on that?
Scott, I think there's some parallels to options theory there, where there is an ideal time theoretically to exercise an option on a security. The ideal time really is when you have enough money in to do what you want to do with the rest of your life. It's not about what the calculations on the security are. And there's parallels to selling a business. The time to exit your business is when you're ready and you can live the rest of your life. Waiting around for an optimal payout may result, that cuts both directions. You can lose in that bet. So if you're ready to go and you have enough money, then you should look at a sale. That's great. And then Pete, I know we talked about how your original transaction closed about a year ago, but you've engaged in a few since, and are in the middle of one now. So what's your view on sort of the optimal time and is now right for a liquidity event?
Yeah, I believe that what Jim said is kind of accurate. The optimal time is really dependent on what you want to do with the next period of your life, right? And so it's hard to say, but from a valuation perspective, I would say right now the valuations might be off just a little bit compared to some of the highs of 2018 and 2019, but in my view, if an entrepreneur is ready to exit right now, it's not off enough to make much of a difference. I think the diligence requirements have changed a little bit. In other words, buyers are looking for more underwriting, a little less risk in the business. That means your business has to be more buttoned up than it would have been last year or the year before. So I still think it's a good time. Certainly, if you look over kind of the last 10 or 15 years, it's still one of the best times, but clearly the best time was probably 18 and 19 were certainly the highest valuations for business like ours. Recurring revenue businesses anyway.
Yeah, that's right. So I appreciate what both of you gentlemen have said about a lot of it needs to be driven by personal goals, what you want to do next. And then, the market, well, there will always be some conditions in the market, and just be aware of them and navigate accordingly. Wonderful. And then, one of the questions, and we can carry this into the next session as well, is are we seeing different liquidity structures in this environment? And I'll take that one first, I guess, and say that we have been, and we've seen a trend over the last 6-8 months, particularly, and we're in this season of the pandemic, where a lot more consideration is being pushed to the back of the transaction, whether in a seller financing of some 10, 15, 20, 30% of the transaction, or an earnout that would be dependent upon performance of the business, One of the things that we've seen is buyers are a little bit more skittish. Pete, you referenced diligence, trying to de-risk the business so that they have a little bit less risk on the bet that they're making. So we're seeing that translate in some instances to earn-out type situations where you have more of that purchase price paid out in 18 to 24 months, based on the performance to try to get through, hopefully, this cycle of COVID-19 and get back into a more typical transaction structure and economy. So I think this is the official wrap up of this portion of the Q&A. There is a special link for those of you that want to join in the live Q&A back and forth. That's a little bit of a smaller group. There's a Zoom link that's in the chat. And so if you click over there, you'll see Jim and Pete and I join you momentarily over there in that link. Thanks so much.